In the winter of 1881, Daniel Yoder stood alone in his humble cabin, his heart heavy with the burden of what was to come. The first snow had fallen early, and the storm would test the very limits of the home he had built with his own hands. His neighbors called him foolish, mocked his meticulous planning, and doubted his insistence on perfecting his home's design. But as the snow piled deeper and the wind howled louder, Daniel's faith in his craftsmanship would be the only thing that kept him warm and safe. Before we begin, share where you're watching from. If stories of faith, craftsmanship, and survival speak to your heart, join us for tomorrow's tale. The quiet of the early morning was always Daniel's favorite part of the day. The land outside was still, untouched by the bustle of farm chores or the demands of the world. He could hear nothing but the faint rustle of the trees in the winter wind, a soft reminder of nature's power, but today there was a tension in the air. His cabin, built strong and sturdy, stood against the backdrop of snow-dusted fields, a symbol of the meticulous care Daniel had poured into its construction. The walls were thick, double-layered, filled with sawdust, and insulated against the bitter cold that could cripple even the strongest hearts. His neighbors had mocked him for the time it took to build it, but now the howling wind began to answer that mockery. The storm had come early. The snow fell in sheets, thick and relentless, as if the sky itself was closing in on the world below. Daniel stepped to the window, his breath fogging the glass. He looked out over the fields and knew that by evening the landscape would be transformed. The snow would cover everything, burying the land and leaving only the faintest outlines of the buildings. He could feel the pull of the wind outside, scraping against the cabin's walls. But inside, it felt different. The warmth of the fire in the hearth, the steady light of the oil lamp beside him, filled the room with a quiet peace. He couldn't help but think of the others, the families living in cabins like his, hastily thrown up before winter had come. They had all chosen convenience over foresight, rushing to meet the deadline for homesteading and farming. He had heard their criticisms. His slow, deliberate building process was too much, they had said. But now, as the wind rose in fury, Daniel could feel the hum of confidence in his bones. He knew that his cabin, his design, was stronger than the storm itself. The wind began to howl louder, rattling the glass, and the first flakes of snow began to fall. Daniel turned to the stove, adding a few more logs to the fire. His thoughts wandered to his wife, Esther, and the children who would soon return from the barn. He knew that a winter storm could be as deadly as it was beautiful, and he had built not just to endure the season but to thrive within it. Outside the storm raged on, but Daniel felt no fear. His work, the quiet faith in his craftsmanship, would keep them safe. The snow had begun to drift in the wind, and soon it would be impossible to tell where the fields ended and the horizon began. Inside the cabin, the flickering shadows from the fire danced on the walls, but the silence was punctuated by the howl of the storm. It was as if the world had been swallowed up in white. Esther and the children returned from the barn, brushing the snow from their coats, their faces flushed with the cold. Daniel looked up from his work, a quiet satisfaction in his chest. The cabin, though small, felt as if it was its own world, a place where they could find warmth and peace, no matter how wild the storm raged outside. Esther smiled faintly, her tired eyes betraying the burden of another season's work on the farm, but she trusted Daniel's quiet determination. He had insisted that this winter would be unlike any before, that they would be ready in ways the other families would not be. But even in her trust, she couldn't help but worry. The wind was fierce, the snow heavy, and the fields were all but gone under the white blanket. "You've done well, Daniel," she said softly, as she hung her coat by the door. "But do you think it will hold? The wind? It seems to tear at the walls." Daniel stood and walked to the window. He could see nothing but a swirling mass of snow and ice, the land disappearing under the weight of the storm. The storm had picked up speed, blowing the snow in sideways sheets, but as he looked at his cabin, its thick walls stood resolute. "The storm is fierce, Esther," he said, his voice low and steady, "but the work we've put in is more than enough. This cabin won't just survive it, it will endure it." Esther watched him as he returned to the fire, stoking it carefully. She had heard the talk of the other settlers, the way they scoffed at the time Daniel had spent, making sure every wall was thick and every joint tight. They were too focused on quick solutions. But in his quiet way, Daniel had known that in times like these, quickness could be deadly. As the fire crackled, the wind howled louder outside. The cold crept into the room, even though the cabin stood strong against it. Daniel felt the steady pressure of the storm, but his faith in the cabin and in his work held firm. He wasn't building for what was easy, he was building for what was needed. "We will be safe here, Esther, I promise." Esther nodded, settling into the chair by the fire with the children nestled close. She trusted him. Through everything, the struggles, the doubts, the hard work, Daniel had always been the steady hand, guiding them through the seasons of their lives. This storm too would pass, and they would be ready. The wind screamed louder through the night, a sound that seemed to press in from every corner of the world. Daniel had lived in this part of the Dakotas long enough to know that this was no ordinary storm. It wasn't the kind of snowstorm that could be shrugged off, the kind that might last a day or two and then be gone. This was different. This was the kind of storm that could break the spirit of even the toughest homesteader. As the evening wore on, the snow piled up faster than anyone had expected. The wind didn't stop. It just grew more furious, as if nature itself was testing the resolve of those who dared to call this place home. The temperature dropped even lower, and the fire in the hearth fought against the chill that seeped into every corner of the cabin. Daniel could feel the house groan beneath the pressure of the storm. But it was still standing, still holding firm. Esther glanced out the small window, seeing nothing but white. She pulled the blanket tighter around the children and turned her gaze back to Daniel, who was pacing the room, a quiet determination etched on his face. "Do you think it will stop soon?" she asked, her voice barely rising above the howling winds outside. Daniel stopped by the fire and looked at her. "Hard to say," he replied. "We've built this cabin to withstand storms like this. We may lose a few nights of sleep, but we're safe." Esther nodded, though a quiet worry lingered in her heart. She knew Daniel had thought of everything he always did, but no one could ever be entirely prepared for the ferocity of the land. They had spent so many years preparing, building, and farming, but she still couldn't shake the feeling that sometimes, despite all the planning, the land had a way of humbling them. The children slept soundly, wrapped in quilts and the warmth of the hearth, but Daniel couldn't sleep. He found himself at the window again, staring into the storm, as if he could will it to stop. The cabin was holding strong, the double walls and thick insulation keeping the worst of the cold at bay. The snow might pile up in drifts against the door, but the cabin would not falter. It would stand. He thought of the other families, those who had built quickly and cheaply, with walls too thin and roofs too weak. Some of them had already reached out to him, seeking help. He couldn't ignore the gnawing fear that came with the storm's fury. The blizzards had already begun to claim lives across the prairie, and he couldn't help but wonder how long the others would last. His hand brushed the frame of the window, feeling the coolness that came from the outside, yet the warmth inside remained constant. He thought of the years he had spent learning the craft of building, how he had studied the land, how he had perfected the insulation and every joint. It was a labor of faith, and now that faith was being tested, the storm raged through the night, but Daniel was ready. He trusted in what he had built, in the decisions he had made, even when others had questioned him. His mind drifted back to that moment when the wind first picked up earlier that day, to the way he had assured Esther, and to the quiet resolve he had felt. He knew there was no turning back now. The storm would either break or continue until it had its way, but one thing was certain: Daniel had built not for today, but for every tomorrow that the land could bring. Morning arrived not with sunshine, but with a gray sky stretched thin over the land. The wind had settled, though the snow continued to fall in gentle flurries, still thick and relentless. Daniel stood at the door, looking out at the blanket of white that had swallowed the fields whole. It had been a long, restless night, but as he stepped outside, the silence was almost soothing. The world had changed. The cabin was still standing, as he knew it would be. The double walls, packed with sawdust, had kept the warmth inside. Even with the storm's full wrath, the interior had held steady, sheltered from the worst of the cold and wind. He walked to the barn to check on the livestock, knowing the true test would come in the days to follow. But so far, so good. As Daniel walked across the yard, the crunch of snow beneath his boots was the only sound that broke the stillness. His breath came out in small puffs of mist, but his coat and woolen scarf were doing their job. The barn, built with just as much care and attention as the cabin, stood solid against the drifts. He checked on the cattle, ensuring they were sheltered and warm. The wind hadn't broken through the barn walls, and the animals had been kept safe. He turned back toward the cabin and spotted Esther standing at the window, her face drawn with concern. She had weathered the storm, but Daniel could see the weight of it on her shoulders. They were both exhausted, and the full impact of the storm was only beginning to settle in. The storm had subsided for now, but the cold was still biting. The snow piled high against the door, and Daniel knew it would take hours to clear the drifts. He entered the cabin, brushing the snow from his boots as he stepped inside. "How are they?" Esther asked, her voice still tinged with worry. "Safe for now," Daniel replied, rubbing his hands together to bring warmth back into his fingers. "But we'll need to watch the weather for the next few days. It's not over yet." As he spoke, a soft knock came at the door, and Daniel's heart sank. He had known this was coming. Some of the neighbors, those who had mocked him for building his cabin too solidly, too slowly, were now going to need help. Their voices had already reached him during the storm, carried by the wind. One family had a chimney that had nearly collapsed. Another was struggling with food and firewood. When he opened the door, it was William Crawford, the same man who had called his cabin a fort during its construction. Crawford stood there, snow-covered and tired, his face haggard from the storm. "I need help," Crawford said, his voice low. "We didn't expect this kind of cold. My cabin, it's not holding up, like yours. The roof's leaking, and the fire's barely keeping the cold out." Daniel studied the man for a moment, then nodded. "Come in. We'll take care of you." As Crawford stepped inside, Daniel felt the weight of his decision. The storm had tested them all, and the consequences of their choices were now clear. But there was no time for pride. Survival was a matter of working together, of sharing what they had built. Daniel's cabin had stood strong, but it wasn't just his work that would see them through, it was the spirit of the community. As Daniel helped his neighbor, he realized that the storm hadn't just changed the landscape, it had changed them, too. Now, the lesson was clear to everyone who had doubted his methods. In the end, it wasn't the quick, easy way that survived, it was the one built with faith, care, and time. By late afternoon, the storm had finally ceased, leaving a landscape transformed. The sky, once dark with swirling clouds, had cleared, revealing a dull, pale sun that barely broke through the gray haze. The world outside was still silent except for the occasional creak of settling snow and the distant rustle of the wind in the trees. Daniel sat by the fire, his body aching from hours of clearing snow and checking the animals. Esther worked quietly beside him, her hands weaving through the quiet tasks of the evening. The children had already gone to bed, wrapped in quilts, exhausted from the strain of the storm. But it wasn't just the storm that had worn them down. It was the weight of the past few days, the realization that the simple rhythms of life on the prairie could be shattered in an instant. They had weathered the storm, but it had left something behind. In the silence that followed, Daniel couldn't help but reflect on the lessons learned. The cabin, his home, hadn't just protected them from the cold. It had become a symbol of what it meant to prepare. To build not just for the seasons that had come before, but for the ones that might come again. As the fire crackled, Daniel felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. The storm had tested them all, but they had survived. The work he had put into his home, into this place, had been worth it. And in the quiet aftermath, he knew that sometimes the only thing that mattered was getting through, together. The cabin, now warm and safe, stood as a testament to the strength of simple faith, quiet craftsmanship, and the enduring power of love and community. It was a shelter not just from the storm, but from the uncertainties of life itself. And for that, Daniel was thankful.